All right, welcome everyone to the second part of the Old English portion of this course. We're going to be dealing with all of the elements of Old English that we have not covered so far. And today that means dealing with the verbal morphology. You'll remember we dealt with the nominal morphology last week, also with the syntax, with the way that sentences are put together, with the lexicon of the language, so the words of Old English and where they come from, and finally with the dialects of the language. What different varieties of Old English are there? And again, where do they come from and what is the distribution? These are the four key areas that we will be discussing today. I hardly need to remind you of the tutorials now. If you haven't been to one yet, then you've dropped the ball pretty badly. You should start attending if you can. And you should keep attending if you have already been attending. Here are the times, here are the tutors. All the information you need is there. So, does anyone have any practical questions before we start? Okay, so here's a reminder of where we got up to last time round. We talked about Old English being a more synthetic language than modern English. We can generalize and say that Old English is a synthetic language and modern English is an analytic language, though Old English is not perfectly synthetic, nor is modern English perfectly analytic. We've seen four cases, just like in present-day German, also in Latin: nominative, accusative, genitive, and dative. We also see relics of an instrumental case. And we'll also see synthetic properties in the verbs as well. In general, there are more distinct verb endings in Old English. There is more of a verbal morphological system than there is in the modern English period. And so here's a paradigm we saw last time. These are the demonstratives. And you can see in these demonstratives, some of them, especially towards the bottom of the table, should remind you of your own knowledge of German, because they behave very similarly with these thas and tham forms, thare, being quite similar to des, dem, der. And this is one of the richer paradigms, as I said, one of the ones that's most worth remembering, most worth knowing how to use for the exam, because a sample kind of exam question is, it'll give you a noun phrase and it'll say what case is this in and what number is it in. And you won't have to have memorized the paradigms because, like I say, the paradigms are given on the exam itself. But you will need to know how to figure it out. And the demonstrative is often a really big clue because the demonstrative has more distinct forms than most of the nominal elements in Old English. When it comes to the verbal morphology, as I said, there's a lot more of it than there is in the present-day language, and there are a lot more distinct endings. So that's not to say that every single combination of person and number and tense and mood has its own ending. So the features that we're interested in for the verbs are tense, and the tense system works more or less like it does today. So we've got past and non-past. We've only got two tenses. You'll often hear these referred to in Old English as past and present, but it's more accurate to refer to what's usually called the present tense as a non-past tense because it's used for anything that isn't the past. For instance, it can also be used with future reference, just as in German you can do this with what is formally a present tense. So you can perfectly well say something like, morgen gehe ich einkaufen, and the form of the verb to go is a present tense form. You don't have to say morgen werde ich einkaufen gehen. Right? So you can use the present tense to express a future state of events as long as you have the temporal adverbial, and exactly the same is true in Old English. So that's why we call this non-past rather than present. The endings also depend on the person and number of the subject. This is something that we do have to a certain extent, even in modern English. So in modern English, regular verbs only have one little ending, and that is the S, the third person singular S. For a verb like play, you would see I play, they play, we play, you play, but he, she, or it plays. And this S is actually the only remnant of what used to be a much richer morphological system in Old English. So this the third person ending is the only person and number ending in modern English, but in Old English there are a lot more. We also see different moods in Old English. So there is an indicative mood, an imperative mood, and a subjunctive mood. The indicative, you don't really need to know anything special about. The indicative is kind of the default mood. It's the normal mood. It's the mood that you use when you don't know which other mood to use. It's just the fallback mood. The imperative shouldn't cause any great difficulties because imperatives are something that modern English has, something that German has. Go, play. It's for giving instructions, right? Learn, study. So the imperative forms, the imperative mood is only used in the second person in Old English because you can only give instructions to other people. And the subjunctive mood is, of the three, the more complex, the most sort of marked, as it were. And the subjunctive mood is one that you find used to express unreal situations for the most part. So wishes, counterfactuals. Counterfactuals are things like, if I had been there, I wasn't there, but if I had been there. That kind of construction in Old English that's called a counterfactual, and in Old English you would use the subjunctive mood. In modern English we don't really have a subjunctive. Sometimes people will tell you that there is one. We'll come back to this later on in the course, but it doesn't really make sense to talk about a subjunctive in modern English. It certainly doesn't have any distinct verbal forms. Mostly, in fact, where you would otherwise get a subjunctive in Old English, modern English has replaced it with either a modal verb or an infinitive. But in Old English we still see it. So the example on the slide here is Ich ville that du forgete. I want that you forget. And the special thing about this is that if you see the verb form here, it ends in an E. And that E is not what we would expect to find in the second person singular. In the second person singular, we would expect to find an ST, just like in German, in the indicative. That du forgetest. But because it is a hypothetical situation, an unreal situation, it's something that is desired but is not actually the case, it gets this subjunctive ending, and the subjunctive ending is just an E here. And here is the usual refrain. This system works in many ways similarly to modern German. It doesn't work quite the same, and the subjunctive mood is one big difference, actually, because the conjunctive in German is quite weird and special, and it's used it doesn't quite have the same semantic range as the Old English subjunctive. Like I say, it's best to think of the Old English subjunctive as something that you use to express wishes, desires, counterfactuals, that kind of thing. Unreal situations, things that are not actuality. Okay, so the other thing that's different is the prefix. So there's a g prefix, or actually in Old English, this is not a g prefix, it is pronounced as a ye. Why is it pronounced as ye in Old English? Anyone remember from last time? Palatalization. I hear you all shout at once with one voice. Yes, that's right. That's right. You're so clever. Palatalization it is. The g becomes a y when there is a certain kind of vowel after it. So in Old English, this prefix, though it's written as a ge, is pronounced as a ye. And this ye prefix, the main difference between this and the German ge prefix is that the ye is not only found with past participles. A lot of the time it's found with past participles, but it's also found in other situations. So do not use this ye on its own as an indicator of past participle status. This is quite important. Verbs that aren't participles may have ye, and verbs that are past participles may not have ye. So there is quite a lot of variation here. However, in general, it's associated with perfective aspect. So it's associated with an event that has been completed, or a telic event. If you're not too sure about these terms, don't worry about it too much. The important thing to note is that the "ye" prefix is not a surefire indicator that you're dealing with a past participle. Okay, the other important thing about verbs, and this is something that is true of all of the Germanic languages, is that verbs can be divided up into strong and weak verbs. Most verbs, almost all verbs, are either strong or weak. Strong and weak is not quite the same thing as regular versus irregular. A verb can be weak, but nevertheless be irregular. Strong verbs in modern English are always irregular. But the basic distinction between strong verbs and weak verbs is that strong verbs change their stem vowels in the past tense and in the past participle. So these are verbs like sing in modern English, sing, sang, sung. Weak verbs, on the other hand, form their past tense using the dental preterite, which we discussed not last week, in fact, but the week before. So there was a segment on that when we were talking about grammatical change in Proto-Germanic. So this dental preterite, as in things like played, spielte, and so on, that we find in all of the Germanic languages, this is what it means to be a weak verb. It means that you form your past tense with this dental preterite. And in the history of English, we see a long-term trend, which is that strong verbs tend to become weak. A lot of verbs that start out being strong end up becoming weak. So a verb like help, this is one we saw in an example before. Help, the past tense in modern English, is helped with a D. But even as late as early modern English, you sometimes see a form with a vowel change. You see the past participle holpen, a bit like German geholfen, right? Not gehelft, right? So at some stage in the history of English, a past participle like geholfen, so holpen, has been replaced by one like gehelft, helped. And this is a trend that has been ongoing in the history of the English language. And not only, I should add, in the history of the English language, also in other languages. German has this as well, it just doesn't do it quite to the same extent. If you milk a cow, presumably the verb would be melken, and the past participle would be what? Gemolken? Yeah. Anyone would go for gemelkt? No. Okay, that maybe. Oh yeah, one or two, maybe. No. Or fechten versus gefochten, or I don't know, gefechtet. There are these alternations. There are probably better examples than that, but I cannot think of them right now. So in general, and this relates to an important fact about the system, which is that strong verbs, the way strong verbs work in Old English is a lot more regular, a lot more patterned than it is in the modern English language. In modern English, the strong verbs are basically just weird. They behave in different ways. It's hard to find patterns to generalize over them. Whereas in Old English, the strong verbs are very, very regular. They behave in a set of neat ways. I'm not going to talk about all of the patterns today. But the verb endings look like, well, this table here. So this is the verb to drive. You've got drivan, to drive. Remember that this letter, which is written as an F, is pronounced as a V because it's in between two vowels, so it's a voiced position. So drivan, to drive. And then you've got different forms depending on the person of the verb. So we'll start with the right-hand side column as you look at it, because the right-hand side column is the easiest. The right-hand side column only has two forms in it. The imperative, which is just the stem of the verb, drief, and we've got a plural imperative form for more than one person, drivath. The subjunctive is actually also quite simple. So in the subjunctive, you can see you've got just an E ending in the present tense and, for the singular, and an N ending in the plural. So the only variable here is whether you've got singular or plural. And if you have the plural, then you've got an N. What this table doesn't show is that the length of the vowel is actually different in some of these forms as well. And if you look at the textbook, you can find out more about that. But what these last two columns show is that the system is not a perfectly canonically synthetic system, because you don't find a different ending for every single combination of person and number. Rather, what you find here is a single ending for all of the singular, and a single ending for all of the plural, n. So the subjunctive endings are actually very simple in Old English. What's not quite so simple is the indicative, the indicative forms. But here again, you will see some forms that look similar to, that look recognizable to you. So we've got a system that starts ich drive, du drivest, and he driveth. And this verb actually, drivan, is directly cognate with the German verb treiben. So this ich drive is ich treibe, du drivest is du treibst, and he driveth is treibt. So these are actually very similar in terms of the actual, even in terms of the straight-out morphophonology of the endings. You've got an E in the first person singular, you've got an EST in the second person singular, you've got a th here in the third person singular, and then in the plural, you actually only have one, ending, and that is an ath ending. And this is one of the things, actually, this feature is one of the features that sets apart the northern West Germanic languages from the southern West Germanic languages. So Dutch, Low German, English, and Frisian all behave like this. They have a single ending in the plural, whereas High German behaves differently. High German has different endings in the plural depending on the person. So ihr treibt versus sie treiben, for instance. So this is something where which sets apart what's sometimes called the North Sea Germanic languages from the other West Germanic languages. In the past, you find something that is a bit different, which is that the vowels start to change. So in the past, you get ich draf. And this, I think, the equivalent form in German, I don't know if this has been completely lost, or if anyone would say, what would we say? Trub, trob? Trieb. Ah, okay. Yeah, actually that makes sense. Yeah. So it's still a strong verb. In the second person, you've just got an E. In the first and third person singular, you've got this A form. And the vowels, for the purposes of this course, you don't need to know which precise vowel shows up in the past tense. All you need to know is that a different vowel does show up in the past tense. And that's the really crucial thing here. Because these vowels are... This is quite a major... Quite a major feature, major typological feature of Old English, that you have these different vowels in the past tense. Again, it's not dissimilar to the way that German works in this regard, but the precise vowels are different. And again, you've only got one ending in the plural, and in the indicative plural it is on, so drivon, we drivon, je drivon. He, third person plural, drivon. And then you've got a past participle, gedriven. And again, I've put the yeah on, but the yeah is optional, and the yeah can show up in other places too. So don't take this yeah too seriously. Okay, are there any questions about this? Yes. So the question is about the northern part of the West Germanic area versus the southern part of the West Germanic area. I think the short answer is all of the Germanic languages, all of the West Germanic languages at some point develop a difference between a familiar second-person form and a polite second-person form. But some of those languages, English develops it and then loses it again. Dutch keeps it, German keeps it, but the way it develops in the history of German and the history of Dutch is different. So to say that there is a sort of an overall north-south difference, I don't think that you quite can. But it's a very interesting question. And when we come back to Middle English and early modern English, we will talk more about these second-person pronouns, because they are really quite fun. Any other questions? All right. So those are the strong verbs. Here we've got the weak verbs. And the weak verbs, as you will see, basically the endings are extremely similar. The imperative is virtually the same. You've just got these two forms. You've got your singular and your plural form, both of them are second person. In the second person, in the subjunctive, you see a singular form, and the singular form ends in an E, and the plural form ends in an N. Again, same as with the strong verbs, exactly the same endings. The only difference is that in the past tense, you can see there's this extra d that shows up. That's this dental preterite that I keep banging on about. So this is the dental preterite that I introduced 2 weeks ago, and this is what marks out a weak verb from another verb. So rather than a vowel change, in the past tense of fremman, to do, we find fremede and fremeden in the plural in the subjunctive. And again, there are more distinct endings in the indicative. So we have, once again, an e ending in the first person singular, an est ending in the second person singular, an eth ending in the third person singular, and an ath ending in the plural. And then in the past tense, you've got a different system again, but a system that looks quite similar to the one that you find in the strong verbs as well. You've got this on ending for the indicative in the past tense. You've got this, the same ending, you've got the same form for the first person and third person singular in the past tense. They behave the same. And you've now, because it's a weak verb, you've got this d in the form as well. You won't be able to remember all of these regularities in one go, but the crucial thing is to remember that there are regularities. These are not just random endings. It's not just a complete load of nonsense that has been sort of slapped into a table. There is a system here, and this table is very, very similar to the one that you've seen on the previous page. And fremman is just one type of weak verb. There are actually several classes of weak verb, but again, we're not going to go into those in this course because it's too much detail. Here's the form to be. So this is just here because when you read Old English texts, this is the single most frequent verb you will ever encounter. Just like in most languages, to be, the copula, is the normal verb, the most frequent verb that you will find. Some of these forms you will recognize. Some of them you'll recognize from English. Some of them you'll recognize from German. But the overall system is completely different. It's not the same as the strong verbs or the weak verbs. This is just a verb on its own. It behaves in its own special way. But some, like I say, some of them will be recognizable. So in the past tense, you've got ich was, I was, he was, he was, du were, so you were, we waren, these was and were just look like was and were in present-day English. Some of the some of the forms elsewhere in the table look a bit weirder, especially in the present tense. What's special about the present tense, or rather, as I've already called it, the non-past tense, is that there are actually two different sets of forms here. There are basically, and you can see in all of the present tenses, all of the present tense forms, I've given you a form that starts with something other than a be, and then I've given you a form that starts with a be. And what's interesting about these forms is that you can use either, but there is a strong, strong tendency for Old English writers to use the be form for something with a future tense reading. So the be form, like ich beo, thu bist, right? This again should sound somewhat familiar. He bith, rather than saying ich eom, thu ert, he is. These forms actually have this future tense reading in most cases, which is very, very interesting. There are theories about how this arose, and one theory is that this development is due to language contact with Celtic, which is something I'm going to talk about next week. But I'm not going to dwell on that now. The other thing to note about Old English is that auxiliaries and modals are not that much different from normal verbs in Old English. They mostly have normal verb endings. They mostly behave just like the other verbs. They're not quite as distinct as they are in modern English. So in modern English, the modal verbs are really completely different. But in Old English, they are very, very similar. There's a question? Okay, yeah, sorry, that's a typo. The infinitive of this verb is, there's more than one. So there is wesan, W-E-S-A-N, and there is beon, B-long-E-O-N. So there are two types of infinitive also for this verb. So yeah, sorry about that. On the slide it says Fremman, but that's just a copy and paste error. So the auxiliaries and modals don't differ that much in terms of their syntactic behavior. There is a difference. The modals in particular do have slightly different morphology. They belong to a class of verbs called preterite presents. You can look at the textbook if you want to find out more about them, but I can promise you now it won't be on the exam. So don't worry about that too much. So here are some examples of verbs in actual usage. I went to great effort to get this authentic screen capture from someone's Anglo-Saxon phone. But this is a text from Alfred, one of the most famous Old English writers. It's a teacher talking to a student, someone who is, in this case, it's someone who is a ploughman. Ploughman, the word for ploughman is earthling, literally earthling, which is funny because it's what aliens call humans in modern English. It's like, hello, earthling, take me to your leader. But an earthling in Old English is just a ploughman. And what you should see in this first line, what sagst du? Right? Was sagst du? You've got a nice verb second sentence. That's anticipating the syntax I'm going to talk about in a minute. You've got a second person singular ending. You've got this distinctive EST ending, which has been totally lost in present day English. And then in the second line as well, hoe begast du werk dien? How, like, wie begehst du? How do you go about your work? And again, you've got this ST ending for the second person singular. And then, when the guy replies, he says, I work really hard. And the verb here is derve. Derve at the end, which has a first person singular ending in an E here. So in all of these cases, and you can see the same thing again below, right? The person replies, ich habe Ich habe. Okay? With this first person singular ending E and the second person singular ending S, T in all of the grey boxes. And there finally at the bottom you've got a form of to be. Hunter ich eom. Hunter I am. So this guy is not only a ploughman, he is also a hunter. This is the craft. Okay. So that's just to give you some concrete examples of the kind of contexts in which these verb endings appear in Old English. Right, are there any questions? Okay, in the second part of today's class, we're going to talk a bit about Old English syntax. This tree is really only there to scare you. You won't have to do anything with the trees on the exam, so there won't be questions about that. But there will be questions about the syntax of Old English and about the structure of sentences. So Old English syntax, if you want to find out more about it, you can look at the second chapter of the book by Fischer et al. Or the book by Loos that are given in the references at the end of the slides. There's plenty of information out there about the syntax of Old English, and basically they all say roughly the same thing. First of all, WH questions, that is questions that start with a word like what or where or how or who, these questions have the finite verb in second position consistently. So we don't have this special thing that we have in modern English of a special class of auxiliaries or operator elements that behave weirdly. You don't have to insert a do or anything like that. We'll come back to that later in the course. You just stick your finite verb in second position. So here we have a form of the verb to happen. Ylimpan hu lomp eo onlade. What happened? How happened to you on the trip? So this is an example from Beowulf. So in this case, and this is probably the single most important notion you need to remember, verb second. Verb second is the word order rule that applies in German in declarative clauses, in main clauses, and in interrogatives. And it applies in interrogatives here too. So we see that there's a single constituent, who, how, and then there is the finite verb, and then the subject comes after that. So there is subject-verb inversion in examples like this. So subject verbs subjects follow the finite verb. This actually is a really terrible example for reasons that I've only just realized. But the crucial point is that if a subject shows up in a verb second sentence, if it's not the first constituent, then it has to follow the verb. That's what verb second means. Verb second means that there is one and only one constituent in front of the finite verb. Yes/no questions are formed with the verb in first position, just like in German again. So, and many sentences in English behave like this. So if you ask someone, we have a couple of questions here. Hast du enige gefähren? Have you any friends, companions? So the verb here, have, is in first position. So this is a yes/no question because the expected answer is yes or no. Do you have any friends or any companions in modern English? What is interesting here is that in Old English, unlike in modern English, you don't need to have a dummy subject. So modern English is really, really keen to insert subjects left, right, and center. You have things like sentences like, it rained, or it seems that it is raining, or in fact, in a sentence like, it seems that it is raining, neither of those it's really refer to anything. If you try and think of an entity that these it's are referring to, it seems that it is raining, what is doing the seeming here? Is there an agent here? No, there isn't. There is nothing. What is doing the raining? When you say, it is raining, what is raining? You might say, oh, the sky or the weather, but then it's really, you wouldn't say that, right? The weather rains. The weather is raining. It's just weird. So really, and that's because something like raining is what's called a zero-place predicate. It doesn't take any arguments. It doesn't actually have any thematic roles. If you're in syntax 1, it doesn't have any thematic roles that you need to pay attention to. Raining just is a situation, and if it's raining, regardless of who or what is doing the raining. Right? So, and it's the same in a sentence like mir ist kalt in modern German, because in a sentence like this, there is no subject, because there doesn't need to be a subject. We know what's going on here, even without any kind of subject. Also a sentence like dann wurde getanzt, dann wurde gegessen, you don't have a subject, right? You've got a verb, you've got an adverb, dann, then you've got a verb, wurde, you've got, which is an auxiliary, and then you've got your participle, but there is no subject anywhere here. So German doesn't really care about expressing its subjects as much as English does. And Old English, once again, is like German. So Old English doesn't need to have an overt subject. And that reminds me why I had this example here. Because this example here, hu lomp eo an lade, this doesn't have a subject either. We have how, that's just an adjunct. Eo is in the dative case. It's actually probably an object, a recipient object. And then we have a pp on lade, on trip. So subjects, so Old English isn't as needy as regards subjects as modern English is. It doesn't have to have expressed subjects in every single sentence like modern English does. And here are some examples of this. So the first example is the one we've just seen. What sayest du, Irrling? So what do you say, ploughman? In the second example, we've got Je heerest du, Erdwacher. This is from a poem, Wolf and Erdwacher, which is a very interesting poem. If you're interested in that kind of thing, you've got, this is a verb first question. So up there, at the top, you've got a verb second question. The cursor's appeared again. There, does it? Down here, you can see we've got this is a verb first question, and those are examples of word order, right? The top example is verb second, the bottom example is verb first, and that's what we find in our questions. We also see in the second, on the second example on this side, nu shullen herjan. This sentence actually means now we should praise, and the we, the pronoun, has actually been left out here. So Old English actually cares so little about subjects that it can leave out pretty much any subject if it really, really wants to. It doesn't always do this. This is a very, very old text, and the old texts do this more. Most Old English texts, at least when the subject actually refers to something like we, it does have to express the subject. But in the earliest texts, we find subjects being left out. And here's another one. Norðan snjóde. From the north, norðan means from the north. Snjóde, it snowed, but we don't have an it. There is no it. So Old English is quite happy to do away with subjects in general. Subjects are just not so important in this language. Okay, so verb second, which I've been banging on about, is simply a requirement that verbs be preceded by one and only one constituent. The crucial point is that when the first constituent is the subject, then you have an SVO word order, or SV whatever. If the first constituent is not the subject, then you have to put the subject after the finite verb. So you get subject-verb inversion, as it's called. And Old English is not quite as consistent as a language like modern Scandinavian, modern Dutch or modern German in this regard, because Old English WH questions are always verb second, but Old English declarative main clauses, so normal unmarked declarative main clauses, are not always verb second. They can be, but they don't have to be. So if you have an element that is an old information in the discourse, that is, if your subject is something that has been mentioned previously in the discussion, then you can put it before the verb and you can break the verb second rule in some limited cases. So the verb second rule in Old English is not an absolute rule for main clauses. It's an absolute rule for questions, for WH questions, but it's not an absolute rule for main clauses, for declarative main clauses. So here's some examples. In the first example you see here, Þú havast gekoren þona ver, you have chosen the man or that man. The finite verb here is havast, so this is like du hast, right? And this, here the subject is the pronoun du, and because the subject is in first position, you don't need to do anything special with the verb or with anything else. In fact, the word order in this example actually looks just like modern English. You have chosen that man. There's actually no difference here. But that's only true some of the time. So the second example is an example of verb second, because the first constituent is a prepositional phrase. Remember that constituent is not the same as word. A constituent can consist of several words. A constituent is a group of words. And hopefully from She1 you'll remember your constituency tests. So on that day, on tham day, is a constituent. It's a three-word constituent, a prepositional phrase. And because that constituent is in first position, the subjects and the verb have to invert. So we've got on tham day, wachte God leocht. On that day created God light. In the third example here, we've got a case where a subject pronoun precedes the finite verb. Mar an chile ich jeser. Greater cold I saw. And here we don't have inversion of the subject and the verb. And the reason for this is that the subject in this example is old information. It's something that has been mentioned in the preceding discourse. So that's why we can get away with breaking the verb second rule in this specific case. Because if you see here, mar and chile is one constituent, ich, the subject pronoun, is another constituent, and then you've got the finite verb after that. So the verb is in third position. And this isn't true just for pronouns. We saw another example with pronouns earlier on. So if we go back to the colloquy, we see at the bottom of the slide, hunta ich eom, hunter I am. Right? You've got the predicate, hunta, and then you've got the subject, ich, and then you've got eom, am. So here again we've got verb third because ich is old in the discourse. It's referring to an entity who's already present in the discourse, namely ich, the first person speaker. And then our final example is from the West Saxon Gospels, and there we've got an object, thana. This is like den, that one there. And then you've got the gate guard, segeert or yet lets in. So here we've got an object and then a subject and then a verb, OSV. And again, we're allowed to have the verb in third position because the gate ward, in this particular case, the gate guard is old information. He's been mentioned before in the previous sentence. So that's why we can break the verb second rule in this case. Are there any questions about this? So basically, you get verb second word order And the exception to verb second word order is when the subject is old information, when it's given information in the discourse. Discourse old, discourse given mean the same thing, mean that something's been mentioned before. It's already present in the context. So that's really the main thing you need to know about the syntax of Old English, is this clausal word order rule, this clausal verb second word order rule. Question. So if you say, I have stolen your cow versus no, I have not stolen your cow, is that second proposition given information, is the question. And the answer is, we don't need to worry about whether a proposition, whether a whole clause is given or new information, because that's not really relevant to the syntax of Old English. What's relevant is whether a particular entity, a particular referent is given information. So like the cow, or I, or he, or something like that. That's what's important in this case. In this particular example, it's just anything that has been mentioned in the previous text. Now, the examples I've given you on the previous slide were actually out of context. So when I say that something is given information, you basically have to trust me. But in the exam, you will get a little piece of text, a little piece of Old English text, and that text will be translated for you. And so you will actually be able to see whether an element has been mentioned before in the text or not. So this is actually not as abstruse as it might appear at first sight. Another special feature of Old English is that the non-finite verb is often clause final. It often comes at the end of the clause, and I don't have an example of that here, so if you have two verbs, if you have a finite verb and a non-finite verb, then the non-finite verb often comes right at the end. This again is something that's familiar from German, but with the usual caveat, Old English is a bit more flexible. Old English doesn't have to do this, but it can. We also find a special negative prefix, and the negative prefix is ne. So there isn't a word like not or nicht in Old English. If you want to negate a proposition, you just stick on a ne in front of the finite verb. So here we've got in the example, ne kom he. Negative prefix, came he. So this ne is how you do negation in Old English. That changes later on, and we'll get to how it changes, because that's interesting too. It gets replaced by not eventually. It is similar to French. Yeah, the question is it similar to French? And the answer is yes, it is. This is very similar, and we even go through a stage where you have ne and not at the same time. And if you're familiar with French, you will know that this ne and not at the same time is like ne and pas at the same time in the written language. And this is actually something that happens in the Middle English stage, but we're going to talk about that later on in the course. So, good question. The other thing that's particularly salient about Old English syntax is that you often get what's called a correlative construction. And a correlative construction is basically where you have two clauses next to each other, both introduced by the same element. And the example on the slide is an example that goes, when blah blah blah, then blah blah blah. When I remembered all of this, then I marveled at the wise men. And here, the actual word here is exactly the same. The word for when is the same as the word for then, introducing subordinate clauses. It's the word tha. The only difference is that one is capitalized and one of them isn't. So tha, blah, 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 tha, blah, blah, blah. And this is very common, not just with tha. So we also see thon, blah, 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 thon, blah, blah, blah. Again, meaning when, then. Or nu, now that, now. So the question is, was something like this really used in normal Old English speech? Or is it just something that we find as a literary device in texts? And the answer is, obviously, we don't know, because we don't know what Old English speech was really like. But there are languages that use a structure like this in speech on a fairly regular basis. So the idea that it's completely artificial it's probably not completely artificial, but it might be the kind of thing that people did use more in writing than in speech. Unfortunately, we just can't really know in any greater detail. So here's our example that we saw last week from Othera. And in Othera, we saw, this is the guy who goes to the far north. And here it says, Tha was he, then was he, as far north as the whale hunter's furthest travel. We've got farath here, which is essentially the same as the German verb fahren. And then we've got another sentence, another clause, Tha for he, tha jit Northrichter. Then went he even further north. So this guy really likes going north. But the more important point is that the syntax of these sentences involves verb second. And it involves strict verb second with the pronoun coming after the finite verb. And that actually is slightly unexpected here, because what we would really expect in a sentence like this, we might expect the subject to come before the finite verb, because he, the pronominal subject, is given information, it's old information. And the reason that we don't is that tha is special. Tha behaves in, tha is an adverb that always occurs with strict verb second. So tha is quite a special adverb in this regard. But we always find verb second with it. And so this is a nice example that shows you verb second in action in an Old English text. Subject-verb inversion. Was he, for he. Here the for is the past participle, it's the finite past of the verb faran, to travel. It's not the preposition for. That's important to remember. Okay, now I promised you we wouldn't talk much about trees, and it won't be in the exam, but if you are the kind of person who likes trees, and you're doing syntax in other courses, then this is roughly what your average tree for Old English would look like. You would put your finite verb in the C position, and you would put your VP as a head final structure. There are different ways of doing it, but this is the normal way of drawing a tree for Old English if you're into that kind of thing. Okay, so as far as the grammar section of Old English goes, of which we're now coming to the end, what we've seen in the morphology is that we've got an elaborate system of pronouns and also of demonstratives with a lot of inflection for person, number, case, that kind of thing. A lot of different forms, much more so than we see in modern English. We also see gender. Nouns have gender. So the nouns have grammatical gender in Old English, and they receive case inflections. Adjectives agree with the nouns. Adjectives can be weak or strong, so adjectives can inflect in different ways as well. And verbs also, as we've seen today, this is today's part, verbal morphology, the verbs are marked for subject person, subject number. They're also marked for mood, indicative, subjunctive, imperative, and tense, past versus non-past. And they can be weak or strong. And in Old English, there are a lot more strong verbs. And some verbs like help, that we think of as weak verbs in modern English today, were strong verbs in the Old English period. As regards the syntax, we see that this is a language with relatively flexible word order, but it's not completely flexible. So verb second, as I've told you, is the default word order in main clauses, with a few exceptions that we've just talked about. You can leave out subjects. Old English is a language that does not care about subjects all that much. You can leave out subject pronouns. You don't have to insert all of these dummy it pronouns that we have in modern English. It also, and I didn't mention this, but you can also leave out prepositions and articles sometimes. So there isn't, there just generally aren't quite as many function words in Old English. The language doesn't quite make as much use of these function words like prepositions and articles. It makes a lot more use of morphology to mark the same information. It also makes a fairly limited use of auxiliaries, The negation goes before the verb, so you've got this ne, and at least as far as the texts are concerned, we find a very frequent use of this correlative type construction. This was the tha type construction, with a subordinate clause followed by a main clause, both introduced by the same element, in this case tha, meaning then. Okay, are there any questions about the grammar, the syntax, or the morphology before we move on to the lexicon? All right, so throughout this course, we're going to have a variety of things to say about the lexicon. The thing that it's probably worth saying up front is that lexical change is very, very diverse, and it's very, very difficult to predict. So meaning change goes in all kinds of directions. Some of it seems to make sense. Some of it you might think, how on earth did that happen? So if, for instance, you take the early Middle English Saint Audrey, right? Saint Audrey is a person, and the phrase Saint Audrey becomes the word tawdry, and tawdry means something is cheap and not very good and showy. So how did the saint's name turn into that? Similarly, one of the best examples in general is something in Old English. We've got the word cold, meaning cool or cold, but cold in the actual temperature sense. And in present-day English, this still means cold, but it also means this is good or exciting or fashionable or whatever. Right? So how are these meanings related? How does a word for cold turn into a word for fashionable? What's the link here? Can we make any generalizations? Can we predict what way words are going to change? And I'll get back to that, but it's not going to be simple. But for a start, we can say the Old English lexicon, in one respect, is very straightforward, which is that it's basically, when you look at where the words come from that enter into Old English, they come from Old English's ancestor. They come from Proto-Germanic. They're just inherited. Old English, unlike Modern and Middle English, Old English doesn't borrow that many words. So it doesn't, we'll see next week that there are some, but for the most part, the vocabulary of English of Old English is very, very Germanic. And many more words are recognizable as a cognate with, say, German than would be recognizable today. The other thing that Old English does very frequently is to form brand new words by compounding two existing words together. This is probably the main way of forming new words in Old English. You compound. Compounding, if you again remember your She One, is a morphological process of word formation. It's the word formation that happens when you take two free words and stick them together. So we've got here the word wordhoard, and a wordhoard is a very nice word which occurs in Beowulf. It means a word hoard, a collection of words, like a treasury of words. And it means vocabulary. It means if someone has a really big word hoard in Old English, it means that they've got a big vocabulary. So Beowulf, for instance, at one point unleashes his word hoard, right? He's not just good at fighting, he's also good at talking. And he uses this skill. And there are a few of these words in hoard. So maud hoard, this is like, literally this would be something like mood hoard, or perhaps a better translation would be spirit hoard, or even soul hoard, or mind hoard. And this is, again, it's a hoard of stuff that you keep in your mind, in your mode. So these are your secret thoughts, right? There's like a secret room in your head where you put all of the thoughts, and these are there in your mode hoard. So these compounds can be very, very evocative. And one thing that you see in Old English poetry, I'm not sure I've got a slide on this, but in Old English poetry, you get a lot of very, very creative compounds being used. So for instance, the sea because there's quite a lot of talk about the sea in a poem like Beowulf, they don't just repeat the word say, say, say. They use different compounds to express the same meaning. Like, for instance, chronrad, meaning a chron is a whale, so the road of the whale. Right? If you think of a whale, I mean, it's not a vehicle, it doesn't really need a road, but what would the whale's road be if it had one? It would be the sea. So chronrad is a poetic word for the sea, meaning whale road, literally. Another word used for the sea in Beowulf, or a phrase actually, is ganot's bath. So a gannet is a seabird, it's a kind of seagull, and bath is bath, right? So where does a seagull take a bath? In the sea. So the sea is referred to as the seagull's bath, essentially. So these poetic turns of phrase, they're called kennings, Kennings, and they are very prevalent in the Old English poetry in particular. What's cool also about Old English is that names are very, very often compounds. So Alfred, we saw King Alfred before. His name, the first compound is elf, and there's a whole literature on elves in Anglo-Saxon England. You can go and look it up if you don't believe me. So the elfrad would be something like, and the rad element is like German Rat. So elfrad would be something like elf wisdom or elf advice or elf counsel. Right. So that's Alfred. Hrothgar, this is a character in Beowulf. There's a Hrothgar, and this means wrath spear, like anger spear. Athelstan, Adel, you might think of a German word that is like this. Adel is a cognate of the German word edel. So Adelstan is basically Edelstein. And there was a king called Athelstan, and it means noble stone. So names also are often compounds in Old English. Another one that you see, there are several people in the Old English period called Wulfstan. Wolf is a wolf, stan is a stone. The name means wolfstone. Now, Old English doesn't borrow very many words, but it does borrow some. Now, the largest share of words that Old English borrows is from Latin. And in fact, most of the words that come into Old English from Latin actually come into Latin through before the Anglo-Saxon speakers left the continent. So actually these are mostly borrowings into common Germanic. Some of them are later, some of them occur, particularly later Latin loanwords reflect the influence of the Christian church, and during the relevant period, something I mentioned in the history section, the Anglo-Saxons are usually said to have been in Britain since about 449, and from 597 onwards, there was a very concerted effort to Christianize them, and that effort to Christianize them was basically 100% successful. And it meant that the church in Rome had a great influence over how things were done in the British Isles. And a lot of their words are borrowed for specific instances, specific things. One kind of word, you can often tell when a word is borrowed really early because it's borrowed and it shows the kind of sound changes that you would expect in Old English. So castra, a vulgar Latin word for a military camp. So this is somewhere where an army stops or stays. This word becomes chester. And this chester, so this k has become a ch. And this again is a case of, which sound change? Don't leave me hanging. Palatalization. Yes, that's right. So you've got palatalization. I mean, it says it on the slides, so you don't get any points for that, but worth a try. So Chester is in names like Manchester. You also get place names where it sounds different, like Leicester, Worcester, Gloucester. There's a place just called Chester, which is near Manchester. And all of these words, this Chester has undergone palatalization. What it isn't, for instance, if it hadn't undergone palatalization, you would expect to see Castor. And actually you do in some place names. So if you look further north in England, you find place names like Lancaster. Now Lancaster is not Lanchester, and it shows that in the north of England, those place names seem to have not undergone palatalization, which suggests that maybe in the north of England there was no palatalization. Maybe this palatalization sound change actually only took place, or only significantly took place, in the south of England, in West Saxon, in the West Saxon dialect. We'll come on to that in a minute. We also find loanwords from Scandinavian or Norse. From the 9th century onwards, we get Scandinavians settling in England, not just Vikings, because these were not raiders so much as people who wanted to come and settle and farm. And the early words that are borrowed from Norse reflect the things that the Norse were good at. So they are particularly loans related to seafaring. So the word haven, meaning a harbour, also German Hafen. In Old English, this actually comes from Norse. It's a borrowing from Scandinavian. And the word lahu, meaning law, and many other words in this legal domain also come from Scandinavian, because the Scandinavians weren't just known for their crazy ships and horned helmets. They were mainly known for their laws, which they were very, very good at. They were renowned for having very detailed systems of complicated laws. So that's why the Norse loans are mostly in the domain of seafaring on the one hand and law on the other hand. And finally, there are a few words from Celtic. We might expect to see more, and we'll talk about this more next time. There are a few words from Celtic. One of them is the word for this guy here. This is a badger, a dachs, and another dialect word for it in English is a brock. And brock comes from Celtic. It comes from the Brythonic Celtic languages that were there in the British Isles before Old English, before the speakers of Old English arrived. If you want to find out more about borrowings, there is a nice recent book by Philip Durkin, who's the editor of the Oxford English Dictionary, which will tell you more about these words, not just in Old English, but throughout the history of the language. So this is a useful resource as well. The full details are given at the end of the slides. As for meaning change, well, I've already given the game away by saying that meaning change seems to go in various different directions in the Old English period. So we have narrowing, so Old English mode. This is the word that we saw before in mode hoard, the mood hoard or mind hoard. Mode in Old English was very broad in its meaning. It wasn't really the conception of this whole range of things was very different in Anglo-Saxon England, so it's difficult to be precise about this. But Old English mode was really sort of something in the core of a person's character, of their personality, of who they are. So it was their spirit or their heart or their mind, something like that. Right? And it comes to mean mood in modern English, which is restricted to basically the way you're feeling. We also have der in Old English. Der is cognate with German Tier, and originally in Old English it just means animal. But in modern English it means this word has survived, der, but it just refers to a specific kind of animal. What was the word again? I always forget this. Reh, or the little guys, Hirsch, that's the other one, with the horns and the sort of springing around the forests. Old English also has the word hund, meaning dog, and in Old English it just means dog, and that turns into the more specific word hound that we have today. Not all dogs are hounds. So if, for instance, you have a really small fluffy dog, it would almost never be called a hound. Hounds in modern English are usually big, scary dogs on the whole, or dogs that are used for hunting or that kind of thing. We also see examples of widening. So an Old English barn is a place to store barley specifically. You only store barley there, but a barn in modern English is somewhere where you can store anything on a farm, basically. It's not restricted to barley. Sometimes you also get extension by metaphor. So we have in Old English we have a word for a crane, and originally a crane refers to a bird, and it's this kind of bird that you can see on the slide, right? It's got a big long neck and it's got a bit that sticks out like that. And there's also the construction device, a crane, which is also called a crane because it also has a big long upward bit and a bit that sticks out like that, right? So by metaphor, essentially, the name for the bird has been translated to the name of the thing. And similarly, something like, we don't have one on here, but a mouse for a computer is called a mouse by metaphor, essentially. That's how it originates. You have more specific metaphors sometimes that relate to, that are slightly more nuanced. So to grasp something, traditionally to grasp something would be to physically grab it. So I can grasp my little clicker. But you can also grasp something in a metaphorical sense insofar as you reach out with your mind and understand it. So if you say, for instance, I haven't quite grasped semantic change, it means you haven't understood semantic change. You can't grasp it in the physical sense because it is not a physical thing, right? So the grasping is metaphorically extended from the concrete domain to the abstract domain. And if you think about this, one generalization that's been made about language change is actually precisely this. Grasping is something, metaphors in general move from the concrete domain to the abstract domain. That is, in general, one claim that has been made about a universal tendency of semantic change. We also find shifts in connotation. So Old English zali, zählich, this is cognate with German selig, and it means something like holy or blessed, and it turns into silly, modern English silly. So this is something that was originally a very positive meaning that ended up very negative. So this is sometimes called pejoration. It's when a word becomes worse in its meaning. The other thing happened, the opposite too, amelioration. So we see Old English knecht, meaning a youth or a servant, like German Knecht. It becomes the word knight. And that has a very positive semantics. It's all about these people in shining armor who ride around slaying dragons. Right? So that's an amelioration. It's where the connotations get more positive. And if you want to, in your own time, you can find out more about this by going on the OED online. When you're logged onto the University of Constance network, you have access to the full OED online, which people outside universities don't normally have. So this is a great thing to play around with if you're ever bored and in the library and have 5 minutes to spare. Or you could just go and get a coffee or whatever. It's up to you. If not, then we will move on to the final segment of Old English, which is the Old English dialects. Basically, we can divide up Old English into 4 dialects. With the first cut that we can make is between Kentish, West Saxon, and Anglian. Kentish is the variety spoken in Kent. Anglian is the variety spoken in the areas described, not only East Anglia, which still has a clear connection, but also the whole of the north of England and the whole of most of the Midlands. So that is Anglian. Traditionally it's called Anglian because this is where the Angles are believed to have settled. Remember, Bede talks about the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, and this still reflects this division to some extent. So we can see the Angles are the kingdoms of Northumbria and Mercia, and we can divide up the Anglian dialect too into Northumbrian and Mercian features. West Saxon is the language of the Saxons. Now we know that there were more Saxons as well, right? There were South Saxons in Sussex, East Saxons in Essex, and the West Saxons in Wessex, and the Middle Saxons in Middlesex, and possibly some North Saxons too. But the ones who have written the most are the West Saxons, and that is because of King Alfred, who I have alluded to before. So of these varieties, there are a few very important things to say here. The first thing to say is that we can't really draw a geographical map of Anglo-Saxon dialects because we actually only have access to a very, very few places. I gave you a map on the previous slide, and even this is actually very misleading in many ways, because one thing this map shows you is that there's a nice neat line down the country here. Look at that, isn't that beautiful? I mean, the idea that during the Anglo-Saxon period there was a line like that where all of the Britons were on one side of the line and all of the Mercians were on the other side of the line. That's just not how the early Middle Ages worked, right? It's not how modern society works for that matter either, but it's especially not. No one had a concept of, strict borderlines like this in the early Middle Ages. So it really doesn't make that much sense to think about it in terms of these straight lines. What we actually have evidence for is a few specific points, and that's what I'll show you on the next slide. So here we have a few specific monasteries. First of all, for Northumbrian, remember that of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria was the first one to be particularly powerful. So we have 7th century texts from Northumbria, and the major texts are later, and they come from this monastery, Chester-le-Street, which is north of present-day Durham. So it's quite far north in the country, not that far, in fact, from the Scottish border, and certainly not far at all from Hadrian's Wall. So texts like the Lindisfarne Gospels come from there. We know what texts from places like Lichfield look like. So Lichfield is, these days, a fairly not a hugely important place. It's in the east. It's in the West Midlands, near Birmingham, but it was a very important place for the Mercians, and there was a monastery there, and they wrote things. So the Vespasian Psalter, which is another early Old English text, we know that this was written in Lichfield, in this one specific scriptorium. For Kentish, we have Canterbury. So this is the same Canterbury of the Canterbury Tales. It's right down in the southwest on the tip. And in Canterbury, the Kentish glosses were written, among other texts. And for early West Saxon, we actually have quite a lot. And those texts we can localize very specifically. We can say they would have come from here, Winchester, King Alfred's capital of Winchester. But this is information about single points on a map. If we have to draw a line between West Saxon and Kentish, well, do we draw it here? Do we draw it here? If we draw a line between Northumbrian and Mercian, do we draw it up here? Or do we draw it down here? Or do we draw it a kind of diagonal like this? We really don't know, because all we have is a few texts from very, very specific points. And so really saying that these are geographical dialects in the sense that we understand modern dialectology is very, very misleading. What we really have are groups of texts, and the groups of texts behave similar to each other in certain ways, mostly with regards to their phonological features. The specific features, for instance, palatalization, breaking, eye mutation, the sound changes we discussed last time. They behave very slightly differently in the different Old English varieties. And that is the kind of criterion you can use to say that a text belongs to one dialect or another. But they're not really dialects, they're really more collections of documents that behave the same. So, to give you an example of this, here is two different versions of the same text, the text that we saw at the beginning of the last lecture. This is Caedmon's hymn. This is actually a very interesting story. It's a bit like the, what's the word, the sort of Britain's Got Talent of the early Middle Ages. Because basically there's this guy, Caedmon, and he's suddenly called upon. They're like, you know, sing something, and he does, and it's awesome. And everyone was like, "Wow, dude, you must be inspired by God." And so, yeah, I mean, the story's more complicated than that. But anyway, this is what he sang, right? This is what he composed. And there are two different versions of it: the Northumbrian version down here, and the West Saxon version up here. And you can see some differences between them. So West Saxon has more schwas in it. It also has more breaking. So the word weard in Old Saxon, in West Saxon, weard, W-E-A-R-D in the second line, you can see here that this has an EA. This is a sign of breaking, remember, because it's before an R. In the Northumbrian, we just have ward. We don't have the breaking. So Northumbrian doesn't seem to do. Similarly, further down, we have the word weorc here, and down here we have werk. And this suggests that Northumbrian doesn't undergo breaking in all of the same environments that West Saxon does. There could actually be another explanation, which is that the Northumbrian version is so old that it doesn't reflect all of the changes that happened later. But it's probably easier to take it as a dialect criterion for now. We also see, there are several other differences that you can see here, and I don't have time to dwell on all of them. But for instance, one thing that's quite noticeable here is that the subject pronoun, we, is present in the West Saxon version, but it's not there in the Northumbrian version. That's the version that we saw earlier on. So, as usual, you can look at the summary in your own time. We've gone through a fair bit of information here. I've tried to get the absolutely most critical points ready for you here on this slide. What I want you to do for the tutorial next time is page 82, exercise 5. And you should also look at the text from the Peterborough Chronicle. This is a version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle from Ilias. This is text 2. And what I would like you to focus the most on is word order, sentence structure. And maybe you might be able to find a correlative structure in there as well. We will meet again next time, and I will be telling you about the transition to Middle English.